gave them a bit of money that they could spend on it. They ended up spending $3,600 on the parts for this. This is actually the second version of this. It has the attitude control is by these gyroscopes here. They go up to 50,000 RPM. You can get them for $90 online. They're so good, even in air. They spin for about 7 minutes before, if you just let them go before they go to zero. They use the Lego Next system as the microcontroller, and that made it easy to plug and play different sensors like the accelerometers and the compass, which is the sort of absolute reference system. So they managed to do this task in 3 weeks. The satellite did all the things it was
software
meant to do. They did software completely from scratch that did the control logic for the spacecraft, and they added some software filtering on the camera, so the camera, when it took a series of pictures and only selected the pictures that were fully in the frame and that were in focus, and then send only those ones to the ground. And so they did actually more than they were asked to in 3 weeks for $3,000. Now, I was just trying to tell somebody, and they didn't. It's hard for people to believe, but in NASA, doing a study for under $10 million is really hard. Most people can't do a study under $10 million. So
paper study, right?
A paper study, not building a spacecraft. And so the idea, when we showed this to people, that this does most of the prerequisite functionality of a spacecraft for $3,000, they were like, wow, that's crazy. Now, obviously, we wouldn't send this Lego thing into space. But what you can do, this iPhone can replace most of the things that are on this. It has the accelerometers, it has the camera, it has the battery, it has the radio. It has a lot of things that you need. All it doesn't have is the reaction control wheels there, and it has a crap battery. And we need to add solar arrays and a propulsion system. And so maybe the easier thing is to do what the Russians did in the 60s, which was they would take electronics, and instead of putting it in a vacuum jar and doing all the tests and making so that it works in space, they actually just put it in a pressure chamber and sent the pressure chamber into space, because that was easier than making it work. So what we're doing is rapidly trying different satellite designs based on an iPhone, based on a DroidSat, based on the Lego Next, based on different things, and then figuring out which is the simplest way to achieve most of the objectives we want to do with the spacecraft. And then we're going to figure out how to put them into space by either upgrading some parts of it that need some capacitor that doesn't work in space or what have you, or actually just putting it in its own little pressure chamber to send to space. So that's our little project. Chris, did you have anything to add?
No, that was great, Will. So the really interesting thing about space is that most of the cost of really, really big missions is just buying down risk. So NASA is really risk averse because it's a really big thing when NASA screws up. And so all of those extra zeros on the price tag are all about ensuring that mission succeeds. In the commercial launch industry, where like satellite communications, satellites, and things for broadband cable TV, those things are a little cheaper, and how those companies buy down risk is through insurance. They usually have a fairly expensive insurance policy that means if the rocket blows up on launch or it doesn't get into the right orbit, they can probably afford to fly a second one. NASA doesn't have that luxury because if it goes wrong once, then it's just blown $1 billion and there's nothing else they can do. With this, when things cost like maybe $1,000 or $10,000 or even just $1 million per vehicle, okay, if you screw up, send 5 more or send 10 at a time. Maybe 6 of them die on the way, or you might have common force values, so you might send them one after the other. This is what NASA actually did in the 60s. They were launching, was it 2 a month?
Yeah, sometimes to the moon they would do one every couple of months. Right.
Yeah, and so NASA's kind of drifted very far into this risk-averse culture, where if we can actually get back to just the idea of taking, this is not completely risky. It's not like a billion times more risky. It's only like a factor of 5 or something. So you could fly literally 100 of these and probably get double the science for probably 100th of the cost.
Isn't that what better, faster, cheaper was?
No, that was actually about doing business the same way the transport is spending less money to do the same thing.
Right, and since better, faster, cheaper, a lot has happened in terms of technology that means that a lot more can be done with these small satellites than can be done then. In the last 10 years, 20 years ago, a university satellite could just about beep. And people were like, oh, look, we set up a satellite and it beeped.
Well,
Yeah, Yeah, we have, yeah. But nowadays there's satellites that cost $10 million that are in orbit that are taking like 1 meter class imagery of the ground, which is really good science or really good intelligence or what have you. And that's right, exactly. That's a long string of things, right? And so the point is that a lot more can be done today than that. You could say that paradigm was a little bit ahead of schedule.
Yeah, but if you think about the capability of what most spacecraft have, as Will mentioned, like the phone has more processing ability, and there is almost no electronics on a spacecraft that is newer than 20 years old. And that's because the stuff's been in space before, so we know it works, whereas the iPhone hasn't been in space, so why would I trust it? And so there's this catch-22 where you can't fly something new because it hasn't been in space, so it's not going to work, so you can't fly it. So you'll never fly it.
Right.
So
and 20 years of 18 months doubling times of some CCD array or processor speed or something is so far behind what's the best. That's what kills.
So what went wrong with faster, better, cheaper was it didn't recast the risk culture. It just said, we're just going to cut corners, we're going to do this stuff cheaper, small emissions, we're going to use the same stuff we used before, and it's going to break just as often, and holy shit, well, we missed Mars, we crashed something else, and it was a disaster. So if you can actually change the risk culture and say, it's okay to fail occasionally because these things are really cheap, and in fact they're designed to fail, and the whole mission concept is centered around having 20 of them with redundancy of a factor of 5.
And you don't care if 3 fail.
Yeah, then you probably do a lot more for the same money, and that's sort of the premise here anyway.
Do people have any questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, isn't part of, a friend of mine is a satellite engineer, so I'm not. But my understanding is that a lot of things regarding electronics have to do with their ability to deal with radiation, and also
and that's why you put 5 iPhones together.
No, you're being disingenuous. But there's radiation, there's the sun rays that are very damaging, so you have to deal with shielding, you have to deal with extreme temperatures. You can deal with all those sorts of things, but you're not going to do it for $3,000.
No, we're not claiming that you would send a $3,000 thing, but we're not
And
saying
an iPhone frequency range and the power to transmit signals is
well, we're not going to use
the
the
space
GSM
between the
antenna.
connections, I think
But a
too.
friend of mine heated up a space telescope for $4 million. It can be done.
you can be
Working in
you're
your
talking not 3,000, maybe you can be doing this for 10, 15, 20 million. I applaud what your idea is, but you're oversimplifying. This thing is not a space
No,
craft.
but what we're trying to do is recast the risk culture. We're not trying to claim that for $3,000 you can actually accomplish a complicated mission. But you could probably do a Sputnik feed for around about that order, and it would last for probably over 10 years or something like that. So that's possible. And so what we want to do is look at the extreme left edge of all of the
I mean, NASA's whole role is to support NASA in jobs. That's how it
Well, that's been recast now. It's going to be more like NACA to support.
industry is doing it.
Well, yes, no. But if you know the role of NACA, back 50, 60 years ago, before NASA, it was specifically there to try and advance technologies that were needed by the aerospace industry that they didn't have an internal incentive to get going. But that's what NASA should be there to do. Push forward technologies.
I think so. I think private industry can do it better, cheaper.
We might disagree on that.
Also, have you done a payload comparison between this and something that doesn't say purpose?